Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Mem Aleph. We begin the third perek about the actual subject of idolatry. Beforehand, we were talking about things that were made by non-Jews, food, separations, but now actual idols. Mishnah. Kol hasilamim asurim mipnei shehen ne'evadim pam achat bashana divrei Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, all statues are prohibited to get any benefit from because they are worshipped at least once a year. There's a difference between a statue and an idolatrous idol. You can have a statue that's just made for decoration, a nice statue of a famous person or whatever. That statue itself would not be forbidden to get benefit from if it's not actually worshipped. So, according to the Bimeir, who is the stringent opinion here, all statues are in fact worshipped once a year. It would be on a certain special day in the astrological calendar that statue is associated with a certain day. And because they are worshipped, even if only once a year, it's an idol, and therefore it's an object of Avodah Zara. You can't buy it, sell it, get any benefit from it. Hachamim omerim eno asur ela kol sheyesh biado makel or sipor or kadur. Hachamim say that a statue is only considered idolatrous if it's holding, like in this picture, either a staff or a bird, here's a staff, or a bird or an orb. And these have symbolic significance. A staff meaning rulership, and so to the other things, as the Gemara will explain, that these are all symbols that it rules over the world. If it has a symbol like that, that means that the people that made it are thinking of the statue as a ruler over the world and an object like a god and an object of service. Then that's an idol. But if it doesn't have these items, if it's just a nice statue of a person, then it's not necessarily an idol, it's just a statue. So Chachamim are the most lenient in this Mishnah. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Af kol sheyesh beyado kol davar. Rashbag says, as long as the statue is holding anything, even if it's not one of these three things, anything that it's holding would mean that it's an object of worship, it's an idol. Only if it's not holding anything, and maybe it's just a nice statue of someone's husband or a grandmother or whatever, that they like having a statue of that person around just for decoration. So Rashbag is an in-between opinion between the Bimeir and Chachamim. Now question. If, according to the Bimeir said that all statues are worshipped once a year. If every statue is worshipped, in fact, once a year, then what would be the reason for Chachamim to be so lenient and say only if it's holding a staff? And if it's not holding anything, but it's worshipped once a year, then it should still be a problem. So how can we understand that Rabbanan that are lenient if, in fact, every statue is worshipped once a year? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Bimkomo shel Rabbi Meir hayu avdin ota pam achat bashana. VeRabbi Meir dechayish lemiuta gezar shar mekomot atu oto makom. VeRabbanan dela chayish lemiuta la gazru shar mekomot atu oto makom. So Rabbi Yochanan explains that in the place where Rabbi Meir lived, in fact, in that city, people would worship every statue at least once a year. And therefore, he said, for sure, and everybody would agree, that all the statues in the Rabbi Meir city would be prohibited to get any benefit from. Now, Rabbi Meir knows that there are statues in other cities that people don't worship at all, not even once a year. But Rabbi Meir, he was machmir. In general, he's machmir about a minority. And since if there is a minority, then you have to worry that a specific example could be part of that minority. So since a minority of places worship all their statues once a year, so the Bimeir says we have to worry about that and be machmir, and therefore in all places, any statue we have to not get any benefit from because maybe it's a place where they worship it once a year. That's why the Bimeir was machmir. But the rabbis say we don't have to worry about a minority occurrence. If it only happens in some places, only a few cities do that, then those are the exceptions. And instead, we can follow the majority of places where there are many statues that are just for decoration and are not worshipped at all. And therefore, the rabbis say, yeah, if you're in a place where everything is worshipped, okay, for sure. And if you know something that a statue is worshipped, then you have to stay away from it. But in most places, most statues are not worshipped. Therefore, the rabbis say only if it has an indication, because it has a staff, it has an orb. That shows that they're treating it as an idol, like a god that has rulership over the world. But if it doesn't have those things, then we can assume the majority, which is that it's only for decoration and not worshipped. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel, Be'an darte shemelachim shaninu. Shemuel says that the prohibition that we talked about in the Mishnah is only about a statue of a king. Kings back then would declare themselves to be like gods, and people would worship the statues of the king like a god. But if it's not a king, if it's just some philosopher or statesman or some ancestor or something like that, then it's more likely just for decoration. Not everybody that has a statue is considered a god, only kings. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that the problem is only if the statue is in the front of the entrance of a city or a region, an entrance to a large region. So it's placed in a place of prominence. So everybody that comes into this region is going to see the statue. So that means they're treating it like a god. But if it's in the back of somebody's garden, then that's not a place of great prominence. Then it's more likely that it's in the garden just for decoration and not to be worshipped. Amar Rabba, machloket b'shel kefarim, aval b'shel kerachim divrei kol mutarin. Mai ta'ama lenoi avdi lehu. Rabba says that the machloket in the Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis is only about a statue in a village. In a small village doesn't have extra money, so if they made an idol, then it's likely that it is for idolatrous purposes. There's something really important that the few people in the village got together and paid for something, then it probably is for an idol. But if it's in a big city has lots of rich people and extra money, and they make things that are only for decoration. So everybody would agree that an idol that's in a big city is a statue that's in a big city is okay. What's the reason? Because it's probably only ornamental and not used for worship, unless of course you know for sure that it is a picture of a god that people are worshiping in a temple or something like that. Of course, we're talking about these where it doesn't have a distinguishing factor, so then you can assume if it's in a big city that it is only for decoration, and therefore there's no prohibition of getting benefit. Hold on, is that true? That in the villages, is there someone that says that would be for ornamental purposes? In other words, you're saying the machloket, that means the Rabbanan, who say that if it's not holding anything, then it's okay. So the machloket is about villages. So according to Rabbanan, the ones in villages are only ornamental. Do you think that any villages, small villages, are going to go and it costs a lot of money to go get something and make a statue just for an ornament? Nobody would be lenient regarding a village. Therefore, if they're making something in a village, everybody would agree that it must be an idol. Even the rabbis would agree. So actually, there couldn't be a machloket in a village. Rather, if Rabbah said something about this, he must have said the following: machloket b'shel kerachim aval b'shel kefarim divrei kol asurin. It's the opposite. The machloket is in the large cities, but in the village, everybody agrees it's prohibited. If there's an idol in a village, then for sure it's no good, no matter what, whether it's holding something or not holding something. If they put together enough money in a little village to make a statue, that's for sure an idol. That must be very important. The machloket is in the big city, where sometimes a statue is worshipped, sometimes it's not, and there's something to discuss. If it's not holding anything, if it is holding something that shows it's a ruler of the world, then for sure everyone agrees it's prohibited. But if it's not holding anything, that's where the Bimir says, Bimachmir, maybe it's worshipped once a year. And the Chachamim say, no, it's not necessarily worshipped once a year. It's not holding anything. It's in a big city. There, it's probably for an ornamental purpose. Chachamim omrim, enat nasurim v'chole, makel sherodet asmo tachat kol ha'olam kolo kemakel. So now, to the rabbis that say, if it's holding one of these three things, that means it's worshipped as an idol and is prohibited. What are the three things? The first one is the staff. What does the staff symbolize? That it rules itself under the entire world. this is a euphemism. In the Gemara, we don't want to give importance and actually say what we mean. What it means to actually say is that the ruler, the staff that it's holding, shows that this idol rules over the whole world with the staff. Just like a shepherd has a staff to rule over the animals and hit them, so too a king holds a staff to show he rules over a kingdom. And so a staff in the hands of an idol shows that it rules over the whole world. Sipor, shetofes et asmo tachat kol ha'olam kulo kesipor. And if the idol is holding a bird, then the Gemara literally says that symbolizes that it holds itself under the world like a bird. But it really means the opposite. If it's a euphemism, that is holding the whole world under it. You imagine a bird that's holding something under it, and that is what the bird symbolizes. It rises above, flies above everything, and can control the world under it. Kadur, shetofes et asmo tachat kol ha'olam kulo kekadur. And if it's holding an orb, that symbolizes that it holds itself under the entire world like a ball in someone's hand. And again, here it's the opposite. It really is that if you have an orb in its hand, it's like it can control the whole earth as if it's a little ball in its hand. So any of these three things shows that the people that designed the statue meant for it to be a ruler over the universe. Well, if it's a ruler over the universe, then that means it's a god. That means they're going to treat it like that and worship it as a god. Therefore, it's an idol and it's prohibited. Tana, Hosifu alehen saif atara v'tabat. A Baraita teaches that they added not only those three items, but also if it's holding a sword, a crown, or a ring. Those three things also symbolize that it's like a king ruling over the whole world. Now, why did they think, how come it wasn't in the original list in the Mishnah? They only added it later. So we'll go through each one. Saif mekara sabur listim be'alma. At first they thought if it's holding a sword, maybe it's just a statue of a bandit. You have a famous bandit that people gave respect to for whatever reason, and so they made a statue of him, and he had a sword. He always had a sword, so we put him with a sword, like we have today. Sometimes a general or whatever, and that's what they thought. That doesn't symbolize it as being a god. But then they realized that if they make a statue with a sword, then it's because it kills himself under the world. Again, a euphemism. That means it uses the sword to kill the whole world. It threatens the whole world. Look, I'm in charge of the whole world with my sword, and therefore it's an idol. At first, when they saw statues that had a crown, they thought maybe it's just a woven wreath, a nice decorative thing on its head. But it's not, doesn't symbolize anything more. But then they realized that actually it symbolizes a crown of a king. If you put a crown on the statue, that means it's like they're treating it like a god. Tabaat meikara sebur ish tam taima be'alma ulbasov sebur shechotemet asmo tachat kol ha'olam kulo lemita. If the idol is wearing a ring, at first they thought maybe it's just a signet ring. Lots of important people wore a signet ring. If you have an estate, you're a rich person, so you need to sign documents. So many just regular people would sign a ring, would wear a ring. So that doesn't symbolize that it's a god. So at first they thought, okay, it's just a nice decoration of an important person. But then they realized, no, this is a seal that's going to seal the fate of, it's going to seal its fate under the whole world, meaning it's going to seal the fate of the whole world under it for death. So the seal is like a seal of a king. That means it has control over the whole world to live or die, and therefore they added those three things as symbols that a statue is an idol. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel v'chule Tana afilu serod afilu kisam. Rashbag says if it's holding anything at all in its hand, that means it's prohibited as an idol. And the Baraita adds, even a stone, even a twig. These are pretty insignificant items. So what do they symbolize? They symbolize that the statue can hold the whole world. The whole world in its hands is like a little stone or like a little twig. It's nothing in its hands. And so that shows also that it's treated like an idol and worshipped. Rav Asher asked, what if the statue is holding in it excrement? What does that symbolize? Doesn't symbolize that the whole world is like inferior to it, like excrement. Look, compared to the God, the whole world is like is disgusting. Excrement, well then they're treating it like a God and it would be prohibited. Or does it mean that the statue is inferior to the whole world like excrement, and it's actually something demeaning to the statue, which means that this is not an important statue, certainly not something that would be worshipped as an idol, and therefore permitted, so we're not sure what the symbolism of that would be, and we leave that question standing. Next Mishnah, Hamoseh shibre selamim hare elu mutarim. If someone finds fragments from a statue, the word selim refers to a statue, whether or not it's worshipped as an idol. It might just be for beautification. So if one finds pieces, fragments of a statue, those are permitted. The Gemara will discuss this further, but the idea is that it's just a piece of a statue, and so the fact that it's broken indicates that even if it was worshipped, now that it's broken, it's not going to be considered an idol anymore. And maybe it was never even an idol in the first place. We'll see more about that. Masa tavnit yad or tavnit regel hare elu asurin mipnei shekayoseh bahen ne'avad. But if someone finds something in the figure of a hand or a figure of a foot, those are prohibited because things like that are in fact worshipped. Sometimes the idolaters would not make a whole body of an idol, but just a foot or just a hand by itself, and would worship just the foot or just the hand as a small representation of the entire idol. So therefore, even though that's a piece that's significant and would be worshipped, unlike a broken piece of it that would just be a fragment and not worshipped. Amar Shemuel, afilu shibre avoda Zara. Shemuel says that when it says shivre selamim, which means a part of a statue, that refers even to a part of an idol, something that we know when it was whole was worshipped as an idol, but now that it's broken, it's okay because it's broken, so it's not an idol anymore. It cancels its designation as an idol. So that's what Shemuel says. V'anan tenan shibre selamim. Hold on. If the Mishnah meant that it's even shibre avoda zara, should have said so, and it didn't say pieces of an idol. It only said pieces of a statue. So that suggests that only if it's just a regular statue and there's pieces of it, that's permitted. But if you knew that it was an idol that was worshipped, then it should be prohibited. Why does the Mishnah say selamim? Hu hadin da filu shibre avoda zara. In fact, the law in the beginning of the Mishnah is true even if it's a fragment from an idol. Still, it's permitted. Veha dekatani shibre selamim. And if you ask, well, then why does it say a fragment of a statue if it could have given a bigger chidush that even a fragment of an idol is prohibited? Mishum dekaba mitnei sefa. That's because of what it wants to teach us in the continuation of the Mishnah. Masa tabnit yad, tabnit regel, hare elu asurin. Mipnei shekayoseh bahen ne'avad. That if one finds a figure of a hand or a figure of a foot, that is prohibited because there are other things that are like that are in fact worshipped. So if the beginning said avoda shibre avoda zara, then I would have assumed that the continuation is only prohibited if you find a figure of a hand that you know was worshipped or a foot that you know was worshipped. But we don't want to teach that. We want to teach that if you find a figure of a hand or a figure of a foot, it's prohibited because sometimes those are worshipped. So even if this is just a statue, a sculpture, and you don't know that it's worshipped for sure, this one, still it's prohibited. So that's why in the Resha it says selamim, so that you would apply that to the sefa and prohibit all feet or hands that are found, whether or not you know these are worshipped, because sometimes they are worshipped. So that's why it puts selamim, even though the leniency in the beginning of the Mishnah applies also to a fragment of an idol. Tenan. Masa tabnit yad tabnit regel hare elu asurim mepnei shekayoseh bahen ne'avad. Ma'amai. Now we quote that part of the Mishnah again. If one finds a figure of a hand or a figure of a foot, these are prohibited because objects like that are in fact worshipped. We ask, why should that be prohibited? Or isn't that a fragment? Seems to be a contradiction. First you tell me a fragment is permitted. Then you tell me a foot or a hand is prohibited. Well, a foot of a hand isn't that a fragment? A lot of times, ancient statues, that's the thing that would be cut off, that would break off the first. That's what we find a lot of statues that have no hands, no arms, or no legs because they're easily broken off. So isn't that also a fragment that broke off of an idol? Tirgema Shemuel be'omdin al besisan. Shemuel explains that the prohibition against the hand or a foot is when the hand or foot is on its own pedestal. Like over here, where you have a pedestal and a hand, which means that it was initially made just as a hand. And sometimes these are worshipped, even though it's just a hand or just a foot. Therefore, if it's clear that it's broken off of a bigger idol, then it would be permitted as a fragment. But if it was created just as a hand or just as a foot on its own pedestal, then that is prohibited. Itemar, Avoda Zara, Shenishtabera me'eleha, Rabbi Yochanan amar asura, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar muteret. So back to the beginning of the Mishnah, if something is broken on purpose, then for sure it's permitted, because that means the idolater is destroying it and nullifying it as an idol. And so therefore the pieces of it, when it's after it's destroyed, are permitted. That everybody would agree with. The machloket here is something that broke on its own. It just dropped, fell over, and it cracked off. So Avoda Zara, that was broken by itself, by accident. Rabbi Yochanan says it's prohibited in that case because no one purposefully broke it and nullified it. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, however, says it's permitted. Let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan amar asura daha la bitela. Rabbi Yochanan says it remains prohibited because no one nullified it. You need someone to break it with intention to nullify it from its status of an idol. It just fell by itself, so it's still an idol, and they might still worship it, even if it's a piece. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar muteret misitama batule mebatela. Resh Lakish says you can assume that even if it broke by accident, the owner, the idolater, will nullify it and not treat it like an idol anymore. Because, Memad Amad, Ihi nafshala asla lahu gabra masla le, he'll figure this idol couldn't save itself. You think it's going to save that person, meaning me? I'm not going to worship this thing anymore. Look how it toppled over. Someone shook the table a little, or maybe the ground shook or whatever, and it fell off. It couldn't save itself. I'm not going to bother praying to it. It has no power. It's not going to save me, certainly. And so the fact that it broke on its own, the owner, we assume, nullified its status. So Rabbi Yochanan, who's stringent, now challenges Resh Lakish, who was lenient, from this story. Verosh Dagon, ushte kapot yadav kirutot, and Shemuel, about the Pelishtim, their god. They had an idol of the god Dagon. And when the Aron Kodesh came over there, it says when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon was fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of Hashem. When they stole the Aron of Hashem, they saw that it was all broken. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of its hands lay cut off upon the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. So we see that their idol fell, and it's not that the idolaters broke it on purpose. It fell on its own. Uchtiv alken lo yidrechu kohane Dagon. And then in the next pasuk it says, therefore the priests of Dagon and anyone who comes into Dagon's house do not tread on the threshold until this day, meaning that they still treat it as holy, even though it broke. So Rabbi Yochanan says, look, even an idol that broke, because they didn't break it on purpose, but it was broken, in this case it's a miraculous breaking because of the Aron. So because it broke on its own and not through the idolaters breaking it, it was not canceled, and they still worship it. They still consider it holy. See, they don't even walk there. אמר לו משם ראיה התם שמניחין את הדגון ועובדין את המפתן דאמרי אחי שבקה יסרה לדגון ואתה ייתב לה על המפתן. Resh Lakish says, no, that's not a proof. That just means that they abandoned the worship of the statue itself, and now they consider holy and worship the threshold where it was. And they say, oh, the spirit of Dagon left the idol and went onto the threshold. Those even idolaters know that this piece of stone is not the god itself. They just created it. But the idea is that they create a statue, and then they do some incantation, and the spirit of the god adheres into it. And so when it breaks, so they said, oh, okay, so then, and now that it's broken, certainly the spirit's not going to stay in a broken piece. It went down onto the threshold of this temple. So that's why they didn't walk on the threshold, but they didn't worship the pieces, the fragments of the idol. So Resh Lakish says, I can defend that just fine. And in fact, when something breaks even on its own, the idolaters themselves nullify its significance. Itibeh. Rabbi Yochanan has another objection against Resh Lakish. Hamoseh shebre selamim hare elu mutarim. Hashibre avoda zara asurin. From our Mishnah that says, if someone finds a piece of a statue, then it's permitted. That means only if it's just a regular statue that's made for decoration. But if it's a piece of an idol, then it remains forbidden. Proof for Rabbi Yochanan. Resh Lakish, how will you explain that? And Resh Lakish says, no, the inference that you should make from the Mishnah is not that pieces of Avoda Zara are prohibited, but rather that a whole statue is prohibited. And this Stam Mishnah over here is like Rabbi Meir in the previous Mishnah. Rabbi Meir said in the previous Mishnah that says that all statues, we have to assume that they are worshipped once a year, even though it's only a minority. But in his place, they did all of them. So he suspects for the majority, he suspects for the minority, and assumes that for everything. And therefore he says all statues are prohibited from getting benefit from. And that's the inference. That's why he says if you find a piece of a selem, it's permitted. And we should learn from there, we can infer that a whole statue is prohibited. That's why it said it this way, not to make the inference that you did. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Meir, Nishma lehu l'Rabbanan. Now we're going to ask against Rabbi Yochanan. From the words of Rabbi Meir, we can infer something for what Rabbanan think. Lav amar Rabbi Meir, selamim asurin, shibre selamim mutarim. Rabbi Meir is, so you said he's the Stam Mishnah, right? And he's the one that said that a statue is prohibited, but a fragment of a statue is permitted. Rabbanan, avoda zara nameh, hi asura shbarha mutarin. So can we infer from that for Rabbanan, he would make the same analogy with an idol and say the idol, when it's whole, is prohibited, but a piece of an idol is permitted. And if you accept that inference, that would be a proof for Resh Lakish that a piece of an idol is permitted. A challenge to you, Rabbi Yochanan. And we answer, Hachi hashta, those are not the same. Hatam emad avadum, emad lo avadum. In the case of a statue, when it's whole, we're not even sure. Maybe it was worshipped, maybe it was not worshipped. V'imtim selomad avadum, emad bitilum. And even if you say it was worshipped when it was whole, now that it's broken, we can say perhaps they had in mind to nullify it, and therefore we can be lenient when it comes to pieces of a statue. Avoda zara vaday avaduha miyemar debitela. But when it comes to something that we know when it was whole was worshipped as an idol, then you only have one safek. Then the fact that it broke, maybe, how do you know that they decided to nullify it? Maybe they didn't. Have safek uvaday, ve'en safek mosimi de vaday. In this case, we have a doubt and a certainty, and a doubt will not remove from a certainty. In other words, if you have something that is definitely, when it was whole, it was an idol. So now we have a vaday. We have the status that for sure it's prohibited. And now that it broke, it could be 50-50. Maybe they nullified it. Maybe they had in mind that it's not nullified, and we don't know. So we have to go by the certainty that we had before that's prohibited, and it remains prohibited because the doubt is not going to override a certainty. But that's different from the first case where when it was whole, there was already a doubt. And so maybe it was not even worshipped when it was whole, if it's just a regular statue. In that case, it starts with a doubt, and then it breaks, and now there's a second doubt that maybe they also nullified it when it broke, even if they did worship it. So here, a doubt can remove the status from the previous doubt, and therefore we say it's permitted, but not in this case when it's a certainty. And so Rabbi Yochanan can say, no, I disagree with the analogy of comparing a regular statue to an Avodah Zara when it comes to regular statue, Rabbi Meir himself will say, when it's whole, it's prohibited because maybe it's worshipped. When it's broken, it's permitted because maybe it's nullified. So a maybe can undo a maybe. But if it's an Avoda Zara, if it's an idol, then when it's whole, then for sure it's prohibited. And the fact that now it's broken is only a maybe, that will not remove the status of the certainty that made it prohibited in the first place. And now we ask about this principle itself, that an uncertainty does not override a certainty. Ve'en safek mosi mideh vadai. Is that true? That a doubt cannot remove a certain status? Ve'hatanya chaver shemet v'niach megura mele'a perot afilu hen bnei yoman hare hen bechezkat metukanin v'achad devadai tevile safek asirin hu safek la asirin hu ve'kate safek umosi mideh vadai. We have a beraita that teaches that if a chaver, that means someone who's part of a group that is known to be very scrupulous about kosher and taking teruma and maaser. Let's say he died and he left a storehouse full of produce, even if he just put it into the storehouse one day ago, we can assume that he took teruma and maaser, and one can just go and eat it. Now, this is a case where we know for sure it was tevel before, untithed, when it was cut and processed. And then he put it in the storehouse. We don't know for sure if he had time to take teruma and maaser. It was only one day ago. Maybe he didn't get to it. So this is a safek. And yet the Braita rules that the doubt, the possibility that he took teruma and maaser removes its status of tevel, which it for sure was tevel beforehand. So here, this contradicts the rule that we just mentioned. And we answer, Hatam vadai uvadaihu. No, this does not fit into the category. This is in fact a certainty that removes the status of a previous certainty. Devadai asirinu. We can say for sure that because he's a chaver, he definitely took to the maaser immediately. He would not wait, not 1 hour. Kedri chanina choza'a. Damar bi chanina choza'a chazaka. Al chaver sheno mosi davar sheno metukan mitachat yado. We have a presumption, according to Rabbi Chanina Choza'a, that a chaver would not allow something to go from his possession if he did not take to the man maaser. And if he put it in the storehouse, he wouldn't wait 1 minute before taking teruma and maaser. So therefore, that itself is a vadai. Yes, for sure it was tevel before, but we can be sure that he took to maaser on that very day before he died. Or another answer, maybe in fact it was never for sure tebel. We're not sure if it was tebel or not, because in order for something to be tebel, once produce is only required to take to the man maaser once you finish the processing. If the processing is not finished, then it was never obligated into maaser. And it could be that he used the following loophole. Efshad avad kerebi o sha'ya damar ma'arim adam al tibuato machnisa bemos shela kedei sheteh behemto ochelet betura min maaser. He maybe followed the loophole of Rabbi Oshaya. Generally, you're going to take the grain and thresh it and winnow and take all the chaff off, and then take the grain itself and put it into the storehouse, and you top it off and smooth it out, and then it's completed. And then you'll have to take to the maaser. But a person can use the following loophole and bring the grain into his courtyard, even with the chaff still attached to it. And then his animals will eat from the chaff, and he will not have to take maaser because it was never complete. He never completed the processing, and so he can use this loophole. And then, if he does do that, it never would have been required for him to take to the maaser, and therefore safek. Maybe he used that loophole, maybe not. So we don't know if it was tevel before. So we start off with a safek, and maybe even if it was required, maybe he took teruma and maaser before he died. So in fact, this is a case of safek and safek. And so either way, the first answer is it's vadai and vadai. Second answer is that it's safek and safek. And either way, it's not a challenge to the principle that we said before, that safek will not motzi mideh vadai. We'll see another challenge to this principle on the next daf. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.